Welcome to Dungeon Crawl, a deck-building cooperative strategy game for 1 to 5 players. In Dungeon Crawl, players work together to fight monsters and clear out a dungeon in order to reach the end alive. Setting up the game is simple. Each player takes a player board. For a game with 5 players, the 5th player will control the monsters in the dungeon. Make sure each player has their 3 ability tokens and a hit point marker. Shuffle each pile of cards and place them separately on the table. In a 1-player game, you will use the additional ally deck, but we will come back to the 1-player variant a little later. Separate the monster cards by levels, 1 through 4, and put the monster hit point tracker in the center of your table. Grab your dice, and you're all set. Winning the game. There are 2 distinct ways to win the dungeon crawl. Make sure that all players agree on your chosen win condition before you start playing. The first is to be the player who ends the game alive and with the most coins in their possession. Players will gather coins by collecting loot cards and the player abilities that they choose throughout the game. The second way to win is to battle your fellow players once you have defeated the last monster. Once the 4th monster goes down, any remaining players will roll the dice one more time for a final showdown to decide the ultimate victor. Again, make sure your group decides on the win condition before you start playing. Your strategy throughout the game will differ based on the group's decision. How to play. In Dungeon Crawl, players start in the first room of the dungeon and progress to each consecutive room as they defeat the monsters. Flip over the first monster card as your party enters the dungeon. The monster now stands in your way, and your party of adventurers must defeat it in combat before moving on to the next room. We will go over combat in detail later. Once the monster has been reduced to 0 hit points on the monster hit point board, your party has the chance to catch their breath before the next battle. As long as a player finished the combat with at least 1 hit point on the bottom of their player board, they will reset their hit points back to the maximum number listed on their board. Players will then place 1 ability token on the ability that they want to unlock. Abilities are arranged in vertical columns. After the first monster, players will place a token in the first column, and so on and so forth after each consecutive monster that has been defeated. After choosing their next ability, players will each draw 2 loot cards and choose 1 to keep, shuffling the other card back into the deck. The majority of loot cards will have one of these mastery symbols on them. If a loot card has one of these symbols, players must have a matching symbol on their player board in order to use the statistics listed below that symbol. Any statistics above the symbol and bar can be used by anyone, regardless of whether or not they have a matching symbol on their player board. If you draw a card that you cannot use, then you cannot place it in your inventory. For example, if the knight draws a spell card, he cannot place it into his inventory because he cannot use the card. Players can only have 1 of each symbol in their inventory unless specified by an ability. If a loot card has a strike, roll, and damage symbol, then those numbers on the card will replace the ones on your player board. Picking loot cards is a science and an art. Players can choose to place their chosen card into their inventory, or they can choose to show it to the other players. Dungeon Crawl is a cooperative game, so some characters will be able to utilize cards that others may not. Decide amongst yourselves who will take the offered card. Table talk, negotiations, and trades are encouraged. Any players who finish the monster battle at 0 hit points will draw an Afterworld card. They will play as that new character until the game ends, or they are brought back to life. Dead players can only be brought back with a loot card or ability that specifies the ability to revive a dead player. Once all of those steps have been completed, players will do one last thing before turning over the next monster card. One player will draw a room card and read it out loud. Players will perform the action listed on the card. Some room cards are helpful and some are harmful. Any hit points lost from a room card carry over to the next fight. And that's it. Flip over the next monster card and continue your journey. Combat. In Dungeon Crawl, there are 3 core elements that you need to remember in battle: combat order, attacking, and damage. After flipping over the monster card, all players must roll the d20 to determine who goes first. The player or monster with the highest roll goes first. Then players take turns around the table clockwise from right to left. On your turn, you can perform one action. Most often, players will just attack the monster as their action, but some abilities and loot cards might allow a player to heal or help an ally. Attacking. To attack, players and monsters must make a strike roll. This determines whether or not their attack actually hits the target and deals damage. Roll your d20 and add any strike roll bonuses you might have. If the result is equal to or greater than the target's armor rating, your attack is successful. You can roll some damage. Rolling for damage. When your attack successfully hits the target, players will roll the amount and type of dice specified by the damage symbol of their weapon. Subtract the total of your roll from the target's hit points, and your turn is done. For example, the knight is attacking the skeleton. The knight rolls a d20 and gets a 10. The knight player then adds +4 to their roll because they have the longsword loot card. That brings their total to 14. Remember, because the knight has a loot card with these symbols, the knight uses the symbols on the card instead of the ones on the player board. The skeleton's armor rating is only 12, so the knight's attack is successful. The knight has a mastery banner that matches the longsword, so instead of rolling 1d8, the knight gets to roll 1d10 for damage. The knight rolls an 8 and subtracts 8 from the skeleton's hit points. Last couple things in combat. If a player or monster rolls a 20 on the attack die without any bonuses, their attack is automatically successful and all damage is doubled. If a player is at 0 hit points, they cannot take actions in combat. Their turns are skipped unless an ally uses an action to heal them or the battle ends. Monsters in combat. Monsters attack just like the players do, with one added twist. Monsters all have a special ability underneath their normal stats. On a monster's turn, they will attack a player and use their special ability. Some abilities don't always come into effect, such as the skeleton's Undeath ability, which only happens when the monster is killed. If a monster's ability has this dice symbol, that means that all players need to roll a d20 for a saving roll. Players will each roll one d20. The result of their roll needs to meet or exceed the number listed, or they will each suffer the effect as written. If no one is playing as the monster, then players will number themselves 1 to 4. Choose someone to roll 1d4. Whoever's number is rolled is the player the monster will attack that turn. If there are 3 players, simply roll 1d6, with players numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6. With 2 players, roll 1d4, with players numbered 1, 2, and 3, 4. Some extra rules and concepts. In addition to being a cooperative game, Dungeon Crawl can also be a single-player game experience. The one-player variant of Dungeon Crawl is the same as the base game with the addition of the ally cards. Flip over the ally card. That creature will be your faithful companion on your journey. Allies take their turn in combat right after you take yours. Allies work as monsters do in combat and can also be killed. If an ally dies, flip over the next ally card at the beginning of your next turn, reshuffling the ally deck if all allies perish. D20 cards. D20 cards are an optional add-on to your game. There can be a lot of dice rolling in Dungeon Crawl, so try out the D20 cards to replace the dice rolling for yourself, or the monster. Be careful. With these cards, you are guaranteed a roll of 1 as well as a 20. Finally, player versus player combat. We know, this is what you've been waiting for this whole time. After the last monster goes down, it is time for one last battle. All players still alive will heal and collect their loot cards. Instead of flipping over the next monster card, players will jump right into combat with one final combat speed roll to determine who gets to strike first. If your table had alliances and truces throughout the rest of the game, now is the time to break them. The last player standing is the victor. And that's it. Now you know how to play Dungeon Crawl. We hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and we look forward to seeing you on your next adventure.